Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. For anyone that hasn't been here before, I'm Fraser and I took my first cruise on my own back in 2019. Now since that point, I've cruised with 7 different cruise lines on a number of different ships. And the reason why I started this YouTube channel was, I guess, to pass on some tips and some advice from what I was seeing on board, and also to give the perspective of a solo traveller, but also a traveller that's maybe slightly below the average age of what you may expect to find on a cruise ship. Now, to that end, there are a lot of different myths that are applicable in the cruise industry, and hopefully this channel can help to dispel some of them, or also tell you which myths might actually be true. So we'll cover that in future videos as we go down the line. But in terms of what we're going to look at today, so over the last few months, I've had more and more friends and more colleagues say, hey, Fraser, I'm looking at going on my first cruise, and you've done one or two, so is there anything that you would pass on to me as advice for someone that's never done one before? So are there the top 10 things, or the top however many things, that you would say, oh, you have to make sure you do that, you have to make sure you don't do that, and you have to make sure that you don't fall into that trap, which all new cruisers do. Now that brought me to, I guess, why I wanted to make this video today. And what we're going to look at is my top 5 pieces of advice that I would give to anyone that's never been on a cruise before. Or maybe it is that you just haven't been on a cruise for a while and you want to, I guess, refresh yourself before you get back on board. So here we go. So number 1 is paperwork. Now, unfortunately, this is probably the most boring one that we could start off with. But in this new normal world that we live in, thanks to COVID, there has only been an increase in paperwork requirements for when you need to cruise now. So some cruise lines will require you to get, if you look at COVID certification, for example, if you look at testing results, some cruise lines will test you at the pier. Some will test you, or they'll ask you to get tested before you arrive at the pier. Some will ask you to get an antigen test, some will require a PCR test, some will take a lateral flow result. It's so varied and so different. And unfortunately, if you appear at the port with the incorrect test paperwork, then if your port doesn't have the ability to test you there and then, well, unfortunately, you won't be going on that ship and you won't be going on holiday. So you need to make sure that you check all of the requirements and you arrive with the right documentation. Now, other paperwork that you might have to arrive with is, think about visas or passenger locator forms for arriving into countries that you haven't been to. Now, if you don't arrive with the correct paperwork, then again, similar to what we said earlier, the cruise line won't let you on that ship, especially if it's a visa, because what they can't do is they can't take you on a ship from the US to Alaska as a British resident if you don't have an entry form that will allow you to get into Alaska when you get there. So yeah, just to close that one off, paperwork. Make sure you read the small print and make sure you know what you have to take to the port with you. Now, tip number 2 is moving on to a completely different topic, and it's looking at cruise ship cabins. Now, to be honest, I could probably make an entirely separate video just on this one topic, because I will spend hours trying to find the right cabin and trying to pick the cabin that I want on that ship before I press book. And there's a couple of different things that I will always look for when I book my cabin. And the first one is that I always make sure that my cabin is surrounded on all sides by other cabins. Now, the reason for that is that, typically speaking, you'll get way less noise if you do that. If you find yourself, for example, one deck above from the theatre or one deck below from the pool deck, well, you're going to hear the shows, or you're going to hear noise in that theatre even during rehearsals, maybe in the morning. And you're also, if you're one from the pool deck, you're going to hear sun loungers being, maybe not dragged across the deck, but being set up in the morning. And yeah, I've made that mistake by booking that cabin before, and I absolutely can guarantee that you will hear it up there. Now, other things that I take into account when I book my cabin, elevators is one that I definitely look at. Now, I know that quite a lot of people don't really care about if they've got an elevator or a lift outside their door, but I do, probably for a slightly different reason to a lot of other people. Now, a lot of people don't like the noise that a lift generates in terms of it pings when it arrives at the floor, you can hear the doors opening, you can hear the doors closing. actually, from my side, it's not the noise of the lift that I find really frustrating. It's usually the noise of the people who are waiting for the lift that really, really annoys me. Now, when I go on holiday, I tend to stay up probably a lot later than a lot of other people on that ship, which usually means that I do not want to get out of bed at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning, unlike a lot of other people who like to get up and watch the ship arrive into whatever port we're at that day. Now, unfortunately for me, that has meant in the past that I am lying in bed and all I can hear is people chatting to each other while they wait for the lift to come. And yeah, I just find it the most annoying thing, so I will never ever book a cruise ship cabin that is directly beside the lift. Now, one final thing that I always make sure I do when I book a cabin myself is that I always try and aim for a midship location. Now, what that typically means is that if you look at a diagram of a ship and you've got the front of the ship over here and the back of the ship over here, your cabin should be pretty much bang in the middle. Now, there's a few different reasons why I book that. The first one, to be honest, is probably slightly due to laziness and that I never want to be too far away from anything at any one time. So if you've got a midship cabin, you're not too far from the buffet at the back and you're also not too far from the theatre at the front. So your room is always relatively easy to get back to, rather than having to run the entire length of the ship if you forget something, for example. The other reason why I always book midship is that typically you get way less motion there. So if you're at the front of the ship where the ship goes up and down and strikes the waves, obviously you'll feel that in your room. And if you're at the back of the ship where the engine or the propellers are, then you 100% you will feel a little bit of probably like a vibration in your room. And in the midship, you just don't really feel that, and it's a much quieter, much smoother location. So that's the kind of top things that I would say when you look to book your cabin. But what I'll do, I'll take all of my advice on that one and create one more video that I'll post in a few weeks' time. Now, number 3 for me is definitely a big one, and it involves these guys. So, the number of times that I've been on a ship and I hear someone complaining to the crew because the cruise ship cabin doesn't have a UK plug, or the cruise ship cabin doesn't have a European plug, for example. And I think people sometimes forget that these ships are designed to travel the world. So you very, very rarely will get a ship that services just one market. So my general advice here would be check the website for what plug points will be available in your cabin when you get on board. But the general rule is that if you're sailing with a British cruise line, you probably could expect that you'll find UK plugs in your cabin. If in the same way, if you sail with an American cruise line, you probably can expect that you'll have US plugs in your cabin. So some examples of that would be P&O. P&O will always have a UK plug in the cabin of any of their ships. And I actually was just recently on MSC on Virtuosa, and the cabins on those ships, they had American plugs, they also had European plugs, and they also had USB ports. So what you tend to find now is that the new modern mega ships, if you like, they seem to be really, really well served in terms of understanding that the ship will move, but they will always have European passengers on, they will always have American passengers on. So actually, the world is getting a little bit easier in that respect. The fourth bit of advice that I would always give to someone is to take a watch. Now, what I mean by that isn't take your Apple Watch that has got your digital display on it. What I mean is take a watch that you can physically wind back or physically wind forward. Now, the reason for that is that on some cruises, you will go through into a new time zone. And I actually am still confused every single time I go, because I always say, okay, I won't update my iPhone, I won't update that, and that way when I wake up I know what time it is. But I always get caught out because when we arrive in port, before I get up in the morning, my iPhone has updated to the new time, which therefore means my alarm goes off either at the wrong time or just at a really confusing time because I've tried to second guess the time difference changing. However, if I've got my analog watch beside the bed, I always know what time it is. So that's definitely the biggest tip that I would give from a time perspective. Now, staying on the time topic, the other bit of advice that I would always give is to make sure you know if when you're on that ship, the clocks are going to change. Now, usually when you go to your bed at night, there'll be a note from your cabin steward or there'll be an announcement throughout the ship that will say, remember, when you go to bed tonight, put your clocks back an hour or put them forward an hour. But there's always a chance that that won't happen despite the fact that you're arriving into a new time zone. Now, the reason for that, there's a few different reasons, but sometimes when you cruise in the Caribbean, for example, there can be, on a 7-night itinerary, there could be 2 or 3 different time zone changes. So the cruise line actually make the decision to keep the ship on the time that it was when you left the first port, or the time it was when you left the second port, for example, whatever they decide. Now, why is this important? Now, probably the biggest reason it's important is that if you arrive at a Caribbean island where the clocks have gone 1 hour back, but ship time remains 1 hour forward, then the key issue there is going to be that you're going to go to the beach for the day, you're going to get back to the port, and unfortunately, the ship that you were enjoying your holiday on has already left and is already heading to the next destination, and guess what? You're not on it. So make sure you look. I had this only a few weeks ago with Virgin. We left Portsmouth and we went over to Belgium. And when we arrived in Belgium, the captain said, look, for the purpose of this cruise, it was only a short trip that we were on, but he said, yeah, we're going to remain on the same time zone as Portsmouth, but that essentially meant that we just didn't put our clocks forward 1 hour. So it definitely wasn't the end of the world. But yeah, good to know at all times what time it is on the ship. Now, finally then, so number 5, what would my 5th top tip be for someone that's never been on a cruise ship before? And it would be, make sure you know what's included in your fare, ideally before you get on the ship, or certainly before you start buying things. Now, I've seen it before, where people go on a drinks package, and they begin to then order drinks and buy drinks all the time, but they actually don't realise what's included and what's not included in that drinks package. And then unfortunately they get a bit of a fright when at the end of the week they realise that that cocktail they loved or that whiskey they were really enjoying actually was chargeable, and they're met with a bill that obviously they have to pay for it because it wasn't included in their price. Now, drinks packages is one thing, but also make sure that when you book your cruise, you fully understand what's included and what's not included, to make sure that when you get on board, you're actually going to enjoy your holiday. Now, some cruise lines, the fare that's advertised online looks really, really competitive or actually really affordable and really quite budget. And others, the fare looks really, really high. Now, I actually had it recently with a cruise line in the UK where the fare almost looked too cheap. So for 7 nights, they wanted about £500 for a solo traveller, which I have never seen a fare that low before. But the reality is, once you get on board that ship, you have to pay for quite a lot of things, and there's quite a lot of opportunity there for you to get tempted and for you to give more money. So, for example, you could buy, as we said a minute ago, you could buy a drinks package, and that would be another £40 a day. Or you could buy your drinks one at a time as you go, which would be £5, £6, £7 every time that you go to the bar. Other things that you would want to buy, you'd probably want to book a shore excursion, which can sometimes be £50, it can sometimes be £250. So always make sure when you book your cruise, are you comfortable with not only the price of the fare, but also the price of what things are going to be when you get on board. And yeah, I guess that probably sums up my top 5 tips that I would give to people that haven't been on a cruise before. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video that I'll upload one over the next couple of weeks to look at all of the different bits of advice that I would give to someone for selecting the perfect cabin. Anyone that's ever been through that process with me knows that, yeah, it takes quite a while for me to finally get to the point where I'm happy with a cabin, and hopefully some of that advice that I can pass on to you. But look, for now, thank you so much for watching, and yeah, I'll catch up with you soon. Thanks. Bye.